My neighbor fell asleep on my lap and murmured, "You still owe me one real date." Hey, my name is Dean Mercer. I'm 31 years old, and I run a bakery on the corner of Spring Street and Commerce in Galena, Illinois, a small river town in the far northwest corner of the state where the streets still run on brick and the whole place smells like the Mississippi after rain. The bakery is called Mercer's, which was my mother's name before it was mine. Painted gold on the front window in letters that have started to flake at the edges and that I keep meaning to have redone and never do. It's a narrow brick storefront with a tin ceiling and an oven older than I am. And I live in the apartment directly above it, up a back stair, which means I have never in my adult life had to drive to work and never once been late. My day starts at 4 in the morning, in the dark, which is the part nobody romanticizes and the part I love the most. I come down the back stair before the streetlights have given up, and I turn on the ovens, and I pull the dough I shaped the night before out of the cooler, and I work alone in a pool of light at the front of a dark town while everyone in it sleeps. I feed the sourdough starter that my mother kept alive for 30 years and that I have kept alive for 3 more. I shape rolls and score loaves and laminate the croissant dough in long cold folds. By 6, the case is full, and the light is coming up over the river, and the first regulars are knocking on the glass. Edith, always first, 68 years old. The same cinnamon roll at the same corner table every single morning since before I owned the place. I bake until 2, I clean until 3. I do the books I'm bad at, I climb the back stair, I eat standing up over the sink, and I'm asleep by 8 because 4 comes early. The phone doesn't ring after that hour. There's nobody it would be. There's a thing my mother used to say, with her hands in dough, that I think about more than I should. She'd press a thumb into a loaf that had gone flat and somebody else would have thrown out, and she'd say, "This isn't dead. It's just cold and frightened. Give it warmth and time and leave it be and it'll come back to you." She was talking about bread. She was always only ever talking about bread, my mother. But she was right about it the way some people are accidentally right about everything. She died 3 years ago. Pancreatic, the fast kind. 3 months from the word to the funeral. And I spent most of those 3 months in the hospital in Dubuque and the bakery dark and shuttered. And the morning after we buried her, I came down the back stair and turned on the ovens and started baking her recipes because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I've been baking them ever since. Every loaf in that case is hers. I haven't put a single thing of my own in the window in 3 years. I tell myself it's loyalty. It's a kind of loyalty. It's also a man keeping the oven warm for somebody who's never coming back down the stair. And somewhere in there, I stopped being able to tell the difference and stopped trying to. I had made my peace with the dark and the early hours and the company of a dead woman's recipes. The way you make peace with a habit, you know, isn't good for you. And then, on a hot morning at the end of June, a moving truck I'd never seen pulled up in front of the empty half of the building next door. And that was the morning everything I'd settled into came unsettled. The other storefront on our corner had been vacant for 2 years, with an apartment above it just like mine, and I'd gotten used to the quiet of it. The truck had 2 men who clearly wanted to be somewhere else, and behind it, a tired blue sedan. And out of the sedan came a woman and a small child. And I watched them from behind my own glass the way you watch weather. The woman was maybe 29. She had blonde hair gone dark with sweat and pushed back off her face with one wrist, and a man's chambray shirt knotted at the waist with the sleeves shoved up. And she was carrying a box that was clearly too heavy, the muscles in her arms tight with it, her jaw set like she'd decided pain was a thing that happened to other people. There was a yellowed bruise on her forearm. The old kind, the fading kind. And she was directing the movers in a voice that was polite and exhausted and used to not being listened to. And beside her, holding the hem of her shirt with one fist and not making a sound, was a little girl, maybe 6, with the same blonde hair and 2 crooked braids somebody had done in a hurry, watching the whole street with enormous, careful eyes and saying absolutely nothing. I want to be honest about what I almost did, which was nothing. I am good at nothing. I had bread proofing and a case to fill and 3 years of practice keeping to my side of the glass. New neighbors meant conversation, and conversation meant questions about why a man my age was alone above a bakery, and I had no appetite for any of it. I turned back to my bench. But then one of the movers said something I didn't hear, and dropped his end of a mattress on the curb and got back in the truck and pulled away. Both of them, just left, the job half done, a whole household stacked on the sidewalk in the rising heat. And the woman stood there in the wreck of her own moving day, with her hands open at her sides. And the little girl looked up at her. And the woman put a smile on for the child that cost her something I could see from 40 feet away. And I thought about my mother pressing her thumb into a flat loaf. And I untied my apron and went out into the heat. That was Grace. Grace Calloway, and the silent girl was Wren, who was 6 and who, I would learn, had not spoken more than a handful of words to anyone since the spring, since the divorce and the leaving and the long drive to a town she'd never seen. Grace had taken the apartment over the empty storefront because it was cheap, and it was 300 miles from the man she'd left, and it was the first door that had opened. She'd taken a job waiting tables at the supper club out on the highway, nights, which is why she would come home gray with tiredness. And she had a 6-year-old and no one in this town and a blue sedan that made a sound I didn't like. And I carried boxes up her back stair for 2 hours in the heat without either of us saying much. And at the end of it, she tried to give me $20 she clearly couldn't spare. And I told her the first lie I ever told her, which was that I had already eaten and wasn't hungry, so she should keep it. I started leaving bread on her landing. Just the day-old loaves, the ones that wouldn't sell. Which is true and was also an excuse. A bakery makes too much bread, that's the nature of it. Somebody should eat it. The first morning I left a loaf and a small bag of rolls outside her door before my 4 o'clock start. And when I came down the next day, there was a note in a child's careful printing. Every letter its own struggle. Thank you for the bread. And under it, smaller. The bird one is my favorite. I'd shaped a roll like a little bird that first batch without thinking about it, the way my mother used to for kids who came in scared of the big dark oven. I started making one every day. I'd leave it on top, separate, where a small person would find it. Wren took to coming down to the bakery. She'd appear at the glass in the gray light before her mother woke, in pajamas and rubber boots, and just watch me work, not knocking, not asking. And I'd let her in and give her a stool and a lump of scrap dough, and she'd shape it into things, a snail, a worm, a flat thing she said was a turtle, and put them on my tray with the real bread, and I'd bake them and give them back to her hard as rocks, and she'd be delighted. She didn't talk. For a long time she didn't talk, but she'd point and shape, and once she laughed when a roll exploded in the oven, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And I heard a sound behind me and turned as Grace was standing in the doorway in her work clothes, having come to collect her runaway daughter, and she had her hand over her mouth. And she said when she could. She hasn't laughed since March. Grace was not a soft person, which I want to be clear about, because the easy version of this story makes her a wounded thing that needed mending, and she was nothing of the kind. She was sharp and proud and funny in a dry, sideways way. And the first real conversation we had was an argument. She'd come down one morning while I was fighting my croissant dough, which had been fighting me back for a week. The butter kept breaking through, the layers kept tearing. And I'd been baking my mother's recipes so long, I'd forgotten I'd never actually been good at the laminated ones. Those had always been hers. And Grace watched me wreck a third batch and then said mildly, leaning in the doorway with her coffee, "Your butter's too warm, and you're overworking it. You're treating it like bread. It's not bread." I told her, a little stiff, that I'd been doing this my whole life. "You've been doing bread your whole life," she said. "This is pastry. Different animal." And she set down her coffee and washed her hands without being asked, and took the dough away from me. And her hands moved over it in a way mine never had, quick and cold and certain, folding it into thirds, turning it a quarter, her thumbs reading the temperature of the butter through the dough like a thing she could feel. You want it cold enough to stay in layers, but warm enough to stretch. There's about a 4-degree window. You learn to feel it. She handed it back. "Rest it. 20 minutes. Don't touch it. You keep touching it because you can't stand to leave it alone. And that's the whole problem." I baked those croissants, and they came out of the oven in proper layers for the first time since my mother died. And I stood there looking at them. And Grace was already heading back up to her own stair, and I called after her, "Where'd you learn that?" She stopped on the bottom step. She had a look on her face I'd see again, the look of somebody deciding how much to say. "Culinary school," she said finally. "I was a pastry chef before." She didn't say before what. 8 years. I had a station at a real place in the city. I was good. She picked at the chipping gold paint on my window frame with one nail. Then I got married, and it turned out a wife with flour under her nails wasn't the look he wanted, so I stopped. She shrugged. The kind of shrug that's holding a lot. First time I've touched dough in 5 years. Felt weird. And she went up the stairs before I could say anything. And I stood in my bakery understanding that the exhausted woman next door who waited tables at night had been a better baker than me before she was 30, and had given it up for a man. And that the giving up was a wound she carried the same way I carried my mother. And that neither of us was going to talk about any of it directly because that wasn't how either of us was built. But I made room for her after that. I didn't ask. I just started leaving the laminated dough for the mornings she was down there and an apron of my mother's on the hook by the door. And I'd say something like, "I can never get the Danishes right, even when I could." And she'd sigh like I was a burden and tie the apron on and fix them. And her hands would remember a thing her life had tried to make her forget. And Wren would shape her little dough birds beside her mother. And for a few mornings a week, my dark bakery before dawn had 3 people in it instead of 1, and a dead woman's recipes. The first Saturday in August was the town market, which sets up in the square down by the old depot. And I'd been working a stall there every summer since before my mother died, the same folding table, the same banker's boxes of bread, a decent morning's money, and a long, boring stretch of standing around in the sun. That year I asked Grace if she wanted to bring some of the pastry. I framed it as a favor to me, more product, split the table fee. She saw through it the way she saw through everything, but she came anyway. And she brought a tray of the Danishes she'd been making down in my dark kitchen, fruit ones, apricot and sour cherry, glossy and laminated in proper layers. And she set them out next to my plain, honest loaves looking like they'd wandered in from a different and much fancier life. They were gone in 40 minutes. People who'd walked past my bread for 3 summers stopped dead at Grace's Danishes and bought them 2 and 3 at a time. And a woman from one of the bed and breakfasts up the hill asked if we did standing orders. And Grace, without missing a beat, named a wholesale price per dozen that I'd never have had the nerve to ask, and the woman wrote a check on the spot. Grace stood there in the sun behind a folding table with her hair coming loose and apricot glaze on her wrist, taking orders, doing the math out loud faster than I could follow, alive in a way I hadn't seen her. And I thought about her saying I was good. 8 years, I was good. In that flat voice on my stairs, like it was a thing in the past tense. And here it was in the present tense, in front of the whole town. At one point she caught me watching her and said, "Dry," not looking up from the cash box. "You're staring, Mercer. People will talk." And I said something about how they were already talking, and she said, "Good, let them," and handed a Danish to a kid for free. And that was the morning the town quietly decided what we were, weeks before either of us would say it out loud. Wren came to the market too, and stood on her toes the whole morning trying to see over the table, frustrated, too short for the work she so badly wanted to be part of. And that night, I went up to my apartment and didn't sleep right thinking about it. The next day I closed the bakery on time for once, and spent the afternoon in the little workshop behind the building where my mother used to store flour, and I built a thing. I'm not a carpenter, it shows. The joints aren't pretty. But I built a low work table, child height, with a lip around the edge so a 6-year-old's dough wouldn't roll off, and a hook on the side for an apron her size. And I sanded it until there was nothing left to catch a small hand. And I carried it down to the bakery and set it next to the big bench in the spot where Wren always dragged her stool. I didn't make a speech about it. When she came down the next gray morning, she stopped and looked at it, and looked at me, and didn't say anything. Because she still wasn't saying things then. But she ran her hand along the edge of it, the way you touch something you can't believe is yours. And she put her dough on it and started to work, at her own table, at her own height. And Grace came down the stair a few minutes later and saw it, and went very quiet, and then turned away to tie on her apron so I wouldn't see her face. Later, when Wren had gone up for breakfast, Grace said, not looking at me, scoring a loaf with more attention than it needed, "You know that's the kind of thing that's hard to come back from, building a kid a table." And I said I knew. And she said, "Just so you know what you're doing." And I said I didn't. Not at all. I had no idea what I was doing. And she laughed for the first time in a week. And we left it there. The metaphors had stopped being about bread by then, if they ever were. I'd find myself thinking in proofing times and oven heat about things that had nothing to do with flour. You can't force dough, I'd think. Watching Wren slowly unfold over a summer, watching her go from a child who flinched at the oven door to a child who laughed when the rolls exploded. You give it warmth, and you give it time, and the one thing you absolutely cannot do is keep poking at it to check, because every time you handle cold dough, you set it back. Grace had told me that about pastry the first morning, that my whole problem was I couldn't stand to leave a thing alone, and she'd been right about more than the croissants. I was learning, slowly, to make a warm place and then stand back from it. It went against everything in me. It was the hardest baking I ever did, and there wasn't any bread in it. It was Edith who said the thing, the way the oldest person in any room is the one who finally says it. She'd been watching all this for weeks from her corner table, the cinnamon roll, the same coffee. And one morning after Grace had gone up and Wren with her, Edith crooked a finger at me, and I came over and she said, "Your mother fed this whole town for 30 years, Dean. You know what she never once did? Bake to keep herself company. She baked for the living." Edith tapped the table. "You've been down here 3 years feeding a ghost, and now there's a half-starved girl and a child who doesn't talk, living 20 feet from your oven." She picked up her coffee. "I knew your mother 40 years. I know exactly what she'd say. She'd say, "Feed the living, Dean. The dead are already taken care of. Now get me another roll. This one's gone cold from listening to you not say anything." I asked Grace to dinner the next week. A real dinner, not bread on a landing, not flour at 5 in the morning, but an actual restaurant. The supper club's nicer competitor across the river, a tablecloth, and the whole thing. I made a hash of asking. I'd forgotten how. I think I said something about how she probably never got to eat at a nice place without working it, which was clumsy, but she smiled at the clumsiness, and she said yes, Saturday, if she could find someone to sit with Wren. Saturday, 2 hours before, Wren spiked a fever of 103. I came down the stair to drive them to the urgent care in Dubuque because Grace's blue sedan still made that sound and I wasn't letting her risk it. And the date dissolved into a fluorescent waiting room and a sick child asleep across both our laps and vending machine coffee at midnight. And at one point, Grace looked at me over the top of her sleeping daughter's head and said, exhausted, almost laughing, "Well, you still owe me a real date." And that became the thing we said. The dough that wouldn't rise. We tried again 3 weeks later, and the supper club's manager quit and Grace got called in to cover or lose the job. We tried a third time, and I got food poisoning from my own bad cooling, which she has never let me forget. A baker laid low by his own kitchen. The real date became a running joke between us, and under the joke, a running ache. Because both of us knew by then it wasn't really about the dinner. It was about the thing the dinner stood for, which was one of us being brave enough to call this what it had quietly become. The quietest night came in September. It had been a hard week. Grace's car had finally died for good, and she'd had to take the bus and walk the last mile in the dark after a double. And Wren had had a bad night. And Grace came down to the bakery one morning so worn thin I could see the shape of the exhaustion in her, like light through a paper bag. I made her sit. I made her coffee. And in that gray hour, with Wren still asleep upstairs and the ovens just coming to heat, she told me the rest of it. Flat, the way I'd told her about my mother in pieces over the summer. She told me she'd left in March with 2 suitcases and her daughter while her husband was at work. Because she'd looked across the breakfast table one morning and watched Wren make herself small, quiet, careful, folding herself down to take up less room. The exact thing Grace had spent 8 years learning to do. And Grace had understood that her daughter was learning to be afraid in the same shape Grace had learned it, and that if she stayed, Wren would grow up believing that's what a woman was. So she left. She didn't say much about the bruise, the old yellow one I'd seen the first day. She said one sentence about it and moved on. And the one sentence was enough. The plainness of it worse than any detail. "He never hit me where it showed," she said, and reached for her coffee. And that was all. And I had to put my hands flat on the bench for a second. I didn't tell her it would be okay. I didn't offer her anything. I knew better. She'd have hated it. I just said, after a while, the only true thing I had, which was, Wren's not learning to be small. I watch her down here making her dough birds bigger than the tray. She's learning the opposite. Grace didn't say anything, but she reached across the flowery bench and put her hand over my hand, just for a second, and neither of us looked at it. And then she took it back and finished her coffee. And I understood that a line I'd been careful about all summer was now visible, and that I was going to have to be braver than I'd ever been about anything, and that I had no idea if I could. Spencer came in October. He came in a car like Grace's old life, black, German, idling at my corner like it had taken a wrong turn into the past. And he came into my bakery on a Tuesday morning with a lawyer's envelope in his coat and a look on his face like he was pricing the building for demolition. He was handsome in the cared-for way, money worn smooth into the face, and he stood in the doorway of Mercer's taking in the tin ceiling and the flaking gold paint and the dough birds in the case, with an expression of patient, terrible understanding. Like every cheap, charming thing in the room only confirmed what he already knew. "You're the baker," he said. Edith was at her corner table. 2 other regulars were in. Wren was on her stool by the bench with a lump of dough, and she went very still when she saw him, stiller than I'd ever seen her, the dough forgotten in her 2 hands. "Daddy," she said. It was the first word I ever heard her say. It came out small and frightened, and it broke something in the room. "Hi, sweetheart." Spencer didn't really look at her. He looked at me. "Where's Grace?" Grace came out of the back, where she'd been laminating, my mother's apron on, flour to the elbows, and she stopped dead. And I watched the whole summer drain out of her face and the old shape come back into her shoulders. The folding down, the making small. And I hated him then, in a clean, simple way. I'd never hated anyone. He was almost gentle about it, which was the worst part. He told her she'd had her tantrum and made her point, and it was time to be reasonable. He told her he'd let it go on long enough out of patience. He held up the envelope and said his lawyer had filed for custody, and that no judge in the world was going to leave a child with a woman who dragged her 300 miles to a falling-down apartment to wait tables for tips, when the child could have a real home, real schools, real opportunities. He gestured at my bakery, at me, at the dough birds, at the chipping paint. "This," he said, "this is a phase, Grace. You're playing house in a bread shop with a man who couldn't even keep up a paint job. Be serious. Think about Wren. And then, the thing that turned it. Or don't, and let a judge think about her for you. I'd rather not. But I will." I didn't raise my voice. I came around the counter, not fast, and I put myself between him and the stool where Wren had gone white and silent again, and I said, "She's not going with you today. And you can put the envelope away, because there's nobody in this room who's scared of it but you." He looked at me like I was a fixture that had spoken. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm the man who's been feeding your daughter breakfast every morning for 4 months, because you couldn't be bothered to," I said. "And the man whose oven is the first place I've ever seen that kid laugh. You want to talk to a judge about real homes? You go ahead. I'll come. Edith there will come. She's known this family since June. The whole street will come. You think a judge wants to hear about flaking paint? A judge wants to hear who shows up. You haven't shown up. You sent flowers to a funeral you skipped, didn't you? You're the flowers kind." Something flickered in his face, because the funeral line landed even though I'd guessed it, even though I was only saying out loud the kind of man he was. And then Grace stepped forward. Not behind me. Beside me, flour on her arms, my dead mother's apron tied around her, and she looked at the man she'd married. And she was not folded small anymore. She was standing all the way up. "You never wanted her, Spencer," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "You wanted me to be quiet, and you wanted her to be quiet, and you wanted us to make you look like a man with a family. You don't want custody. You've never spent a full day alone with your own daughter in her life. You wouldn't know what she eats. You want me to be afraid enough to come back so you don't have to feel like the thing you are." She took a breath. "File it. Bring your lawyer. I'll bring 4 months of this whole town, and I'll bring my daughter. And you can explain to a judge why a child who didn't speak for 6 months is talking again 20 feet from a bakery and not in your house. You don't get to decide the rest of her life. You stopped having a say in it the day she learned to make herself small at your table." The bakery was dead quiet. Edith had stood up. And then a small voice cut through all of it. From the stool by the bench, fierce and shaking, and the most words I'd ever heard her string together. I don't want to go. I want to stay where the bird bread is. Spencer looked at his daughter for what I think was the first time that morning, really looked, and saw a child who was terrified of him and reaching for the flowery woman in the apron. And whatever he saw on her face, it was the one argument he had no answer for, because there is no answer for it. He stood there another second, deciding whether there was anything left to say that would make him the right kind of man in front of a room that had just watched exactly what kind of man he was. There wasn't. He put the envelope back in his coat. He left. The black car pulled away from the corner, and the regulars let out a breath together, and Edith sat back down and said, into the silence, "Get me another roll, Dean," which was the kindest thing she could have done. And the room laughed the shaky laugh of people who've just watched a thing not go wrong. That night, I closed the bakery early and made them dinner upstairs in my apartment because Grace was hollow and Wren was clingy, and neither of them should have been alone. I cooked badly. Grace teased me about the food poisoning. We got Wren down in my bed with a bird roll from that morning on the pillow beside her like a stuffed animal. And Grace came back out to the couch and sat down in the lamplight. And the whole long, terrible day finally hit her all at once, the way it does once it's safe to. And she sort of folded sideways without meaning to, and her head came to rest on my lap. I went still. My hand hovered over her hair like a man not sure he's allowed. And then I let it down, gentle, and she didn't pull away. She pressed up into it the smallest amount, and her breathing went long and slow, and right at the edge of sleep, so quiet I almost missed it. She murmured, "You still owe me one real date, Dean Mercer." I sat there a long time in the lamplight with her asleep on my lap and her daughter asleep in my bed, and a dead woman's recipes proofing down in the dark, and I understood that I was doing it again. The waiting, the keeping the oven warm and never putting anything of my own in the window. The same patience that was really just fear that I'd practiced my whole life. The same deferring, we'll do the real thing later. There's no rush. 3 years of baking for a ghost. A whole summer of a running joke about a date that I kept letting fall through because some part of me believed that as long as we never made it real, I could never lose it. And here was this woman who'd left everything with 2 suitcases and a child and walked into a strange town and stood all the way up to the man who'd made her small, asleep on my lap, asking me with her last waking breath to be brave about the one thing I was a coward about. When she half woke an hour later, disoriented, embarrassed, starting to apologize and sit up, I didn't let her finish. "I'm sorry," I said. "It came out rough." "Not for sit, it's fine. Your head's fine where it is." "I mean, I'm sorry I kept letting the date fall through." I told myself it was bad luck. It wasn't. 2 of those 3 times I could have made it happen, and I found a reason not to. Because I've spent 3 years down in that bakery keeping things warm for somebody who's gone. And I got so good at loving a thing that couldn't leave me that I forgot how to love a thing that could. I made myself look at her. I bake my mother's recipes because if I baked my own and they failed, she couldn't fix them. And she'd really be gone. I keep this paint chipping because finishing things means they're done. And I kept that date a joke because a joke can't break your heart. But you fell asleep on my lap just now, and your kid called my oven the place she wants to stay. And I'm done being patient, because patience was never what it was. I love you. I've loved you since you fixed my croissants and told me I couldn't stand to leave anything alone, which is the truest thing anyone's ever said about me. I want the real date, and I want all the ones after it. That's the whole thing. That's everything I've got." Grace looked at me for a long moment from where her head was still on my lap, and her eyes filled, and she let them. Didn't fight it, and she said, "You're so far behind, you know that? I've been waiting on you since the bird rolls." She reached up and put her flower-rough hand against my jaw. "I didn't ask you for a real date because I needed feeding, Dean. I can feed myself. I'm a better cook than you on your best day, and you know it. I asked because I gave up my whole self for a man who only wanted the quiet version of me. And you're the first person in years who handed me an apron and got out of the way and just let me be the loud version, the one with flour to the elbows, the one who's good at things. You didn't fix me. You made room. That's a different thing, and it's the only thing I'll ever want again." She sat up then, slow, and she kissed me. And it wasn't careful, and it wasn't a joke. It tasted like cold coffee, and the long day, and the relief of a thing finally said. And down in the dark below us, my mother's starter was rising in its crock the way it had risen for 33 years, patient, warm, waiting, ready. A year and a half later, the gold paint on the window is fresh, and it says Mercer's in letters that don't flake. And underneath, smaller, in Grace's handwriting that I had the sign painter copy exactly, it says Callaway and Mercer. Bread. Pastry. Her name's on the glass now. The custody threat went exactly nowhere. Spencer never even filed, because his lawyer told him what I'd told him, that a judge wants to hear who shows up. And he knew the answer. He signed the papers in the spring. He sends a check and a card on Wren's birthday. Wren throws the card away and keeps the check, which Grace says is the smartest financial decision in the family. The bakery makes money now. Real money, because Grace's pastries pull people from 3 towns over, and because she does the books I was always bad at with the same cold certainty she folds butter. The case is half my mother's recipes and half new ones, ours. Because the morning after I told Grace I loved her, I came down the stair and put a thing of my own in the window for the first time in 3 years. A soft, sweet roll with a twist of cardamom that my mother never made and would have loved. And it sold out by 9. And I cried a little over the empty tray, and Grace pretended not to see, which is its own kind of love. We had the real date finally. I closed the bakery on a Saturday night, which I never do, and I took her across the river to the place with the tablecloth. And Edith sat with Wren, and it was lovely and slightly awkward, and we were both too used to flour to relax in nice clothes. And halfway through, Grace started laughing and said the real date was nice, but she missed the urgent care vending machine coffee, and I knew then I was going to marry her. And I did. That next fall, in the small park by the river, with the whole street there and Wren carrying the rings in a bird-shaped roll she'd baked herself, hollowed out for the purpose, talking the entire time. Because she does not stop talking now, not ever, and it is the best sound in the world. If there's a thing that happens most mornings now, that is the small, true center of my whole life. It's 4 o'clock, dark, the oven's just coming to heat. And I come down the back stair, and Grace is already there in my mother's apron with her hair coming loose. And Wren is on her stool in pajamas and rubber boots, shaping a dough bird bigger than the tray, narrating it. And the 3 of us work in the pool of light at the front of a sleeping town. And the starter rises in its crock, and the whole place smells like warmth and cardamom and the river. And somewhere in there I'll catch Grace's eye over Wren's head, and neither of us will say anything, because we don't need to anymore. My mother used to press her thumb into a flat loaf and say, "This isn't dead. It's just cold and frightened. Give it warmth and time and leave it be." I spent 3 years thinking that meant I should keep the oven warm for her. It took a tired woman with 2 suitcases and a silent child to teach me she'd meant the opposite all along. That warmth isn't for the things that are gone, it's for the living ones, the cold and frightened ones still standing in front of you, and that the only thing they ever really need is for you to stop forcing it and make a little room. And finally, after all your careful, patient waiting, be brave enough to let them rise.